Hello, I hope you are all doing well and keeping up with work, but also finding a lot of time to spend with families, to spend with friends electronically, because you should not be going out of your house to spend time with friends, at least not unless you're keeping 6 feet of distance. But yeah, I hope you all are doing well as we continue on this very strange semester together. This week, we're looking at a major division in American religion that happens at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. And it's a split that we've talked about a little bit before, but comes to the fore in these years. And that's the split between conservatives and liberals. When we talk about Protestants, particularly, we'll talk about them as modernists and fundamentalists. I want to be really clear here on a couple of things. First, this is not yet a political distinction, conservative and liberal. We're going to talk here today about a theological distinction. Today, often religious conservatives are political conservatives and political liberals are religious liberals, at least if they're white. That does not hold true for a lot of Latino or African American Christians. But in the period we're talking about, those kinds of divisions that where you're both something politically and theologically conservative or liberal haven't really happened yet. This division that we're talking about, though, really does mark the religious terrain for much of the 20th and going into the 21st century. Whether people see themselves as conservative theologically or liberal theologically will really tell them who they identify with, who they see as their theological friends and foes, much more so eventually than whether they're Methodist or Presbyterian or simply Protestant. They'll see themselves as very much liberal or conservative. Something similar as we'll see happens in Judaism, although still seeing yourself as Jewish remains quite important. But whether you see yourself as a liberal or a conservative Jew will also come to mark kind of the landscape. So here's our thesis and our question and where we're going. Historically, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, both Jews and Protestants split internally over how to respond to new intellectual and social developments. For Jews, this split led to multiple ways to be Jewish in America. For Protestants, this fight appeared there is important, to culminate in the fundamentalist modernist controversy and the Scopes trial, and appeared is important, to end with a victory for Protestant liberals and moderates. And theologically, we'll be talking about what is the essence of Christianity, and to some extent also what's the essence of Judaism. So hopefully by this time you've watched the video, the God in America video, so you have a sense of where we're going. That video told the story of the development of Reform Judaism, a more liberal form of Judaism in the United States, and the beginning of what we might call Protestant liberalism, specifically related to how different people were interpreting the Bible. I'm going to give some now background to both of those stories and then push them both forward a little bit. But to do so, I'm going to start by giving you the world's quickest overview to Judaism. I would say that I'm trying to do just enough to be intellectually respectable, but this isn't even enough to be intellectually respectable. This is just enough so that you know some of the language that we'll be using later on. Okay, so the world's quickest guide to Judaism. First of all, I need to tell you that the practice of modern Judaism is not simply the practice of what people read about and what Christians call the Old Testament or Jews call the Hebrew Bible. A lot of times, Christians specifically just think, oh, well, Jews, they're just doing what they did in the Old Testament. No. What we see in the Old Testament, for the most part, is what we'd call ancient Israelite religion. It's a predecessor of Judaism, but it's not simply the same thing. That predecessor, though, did have some important components that we're going to see. One was the practice of temple worship, coming to the temple and making sacrifices. The second was the Torah, or the law, given by God to Moses, most famously in the Ten Commandments, but then also in a host of other laws and regulations that were to govern how people were to live together. So, for much of the Hebrew Bible, what you have is a religious worship centered around the temple, but also centered around the law. One of the most important developments in the Old Testament is what's called the Babylonian exile, which for our purposes, let's just call 580. That's when an ancient kingdom, Babylon, came in to Israel and took the kind of elite people captive back to Babylon. And they also destroyed the temple. This was a theological crisis for people. How do you worship now without the temple? The temple where people thought God really touched earth. One of the things that comes out of the Babylonian exile is an even greater emphasis on Torah, on law, on ways of practicing the tradition that centered on things you could do in your daily life when you didn't have a temple to go to. Eventually, the Israelites are allowed to return from Babylon and they do rebuild the temple. And we again have a religious practice that centers on temple and Torah, on temple and the keeping of the law. That's the Judaism that we now call Second Temple Judaism, that's beginning to look a little bit more like modern Judaism. And that's the Judaism of Jesus' day. About 40 years after the death of Jesus, the Romans destroyed the Jewish temple again, and it's never been rebuilt. So, no more temple. In the intervening, after that, in the centuries after that, Jews began to write down all of their laws and discussions about the law. So they had many laws written in the Hebrew Bible, but there were others that had come down through an oral tradition. Those began to be compiled, and the debates about them began to be compiled. And what came out of that was a compendium, an encyclopedia of laws called the Talmud. And these laws governed all sorts of things, what you could eat and what you could wear, and how you were to observe the Sabbath, and what you could and could not do on the Sabbath. So, as we head into debates around the practice of the law, what we're talking about are debates about the Talmud and what is binding, what is not binding to Jewish life. Again, Judaism oversimplified. For much of the history of Judaism, then, say from year 200 to Isaac Meyer Wise, not quite, but close enough, there are some things to keep in mind. Judaism was considered a people, a group of people who had a common religious heritage and a religion. Both of those things. So you were identified with a group of people and who had this kind of religious heritage, and you had a common religious practice. And for most of that tradition, both the moral law and the ritual law, or what you might call the ceremonial law, mattered. For those people who are like, I don't know the difference between those two, here's what that means. The moral law has more to do with things like loving God and neighbor, serving the poor, not price gouging, those kinds of things that are about morality. The ritual law, or the ceremonial law, as it will come to be understood, has to do with things like keeping kosher, practicing kosher is the food laws in Judaism. Things like you can't eat milk and meat together, or that you need to not eat shellfish, as you saw in the video, right? That was a major problem at the banquet for the rabbis. Well, this is where this comes from. So both a moral law and a ceremonial law that people probably didn't think of in those kind of two different terms for most of Jewish history. All right, a few notes about Judaism in Europe, again, in our incredibly oversimplified gavant here through Jewish history. There are varying degrees of integration over the course of the Middle Ages and early modern Europe between Jews and Gentiles or non-Jews. Sometimes Jews were allowed to participate fully in society, but often they weren't. They were outsiders, and they often faced the threat or actual persecution. However, during the Enlightenment, that period we talked about earlier, so think Thomas Jefferson, 1700s, there was increased toleration of Judaism in parts of Western Europe, specifically in Germany. Jews talked about this as emancipation, as freedom from the threat of persecution. And one of the results of this emancipation was a movement by some Jews in Germany toward reform, toward making their practices a little bit more like the culture around them that was more accepting of them. So things like a shortened liturgy, sermons no longer in Hebrew but in the vernacular language, so in this case, Germany. Um, Mixed choirs, men and women sitting together, things like that, things that would be more like the Protestant world around them. Moving to America, there was a long history of Jews in America, starting in 1654 with Jews coming to what was then New Amsterdam, or is now New York. In many of the colonies, Jews were not able to vote. That included Pennsylvania, where even our good Quakers required that you be a Trinitarian. But after the Constitution, Jews had the same rights as everybody else, owing to the First Amendment. They're still, though, an incredibly tiny minority of the population. Between 1820 and 1880, about 250,000 Jews came to the US, mainly from Central Europe, in places where the Enlightenment and the Reform movement had had some power. And then between 1881 and 1924, nearly 2 million Jews come to the US, more of these now from Eastern Europe. And those two waves of immigration and the different people who come are important. That first wave, the wave coming from Central Europe, was one of the waves interested in the Reform movement. And this is what you learned about with Isaac Meyer Wise. This was a movement that wanted to emphasize Judaism as a religion and a moral religion, not one bound by the ritual or the moral law. You saw that again with Isaac Meyer Wise, right? Eating shellfish. That violates kosher completely. But Isaac Meyer Wise said that's not important to Judaism. What's important to Judaism is the moral law. One of the major statements of Reform Judaism came in what's called the Pittsburgh Platform of 1885. And here's a few of its lines. We recognize in the Mosaic legislation, that means the books of the Hebrew Bible laying out the law, a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine. And today we accept as binding only its moral laws, and only maintain such ceremonies that elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. So we still consider the moral law binding, but if there's a ritual law or ceremonial law that we no longer see a use for, we're not going to do it. We hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws as regulate diet, it's kosher, priestly purity and dress, originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual stance. These were old ideas from other times. We're new modern people. We don't have to be bound by these old traditions. And then 6, we recognize in Judaism a progressive religion, ever striving to be in accord with the postulates of reason. Reason, huh? We've heard that before, and we're going to hear it again. So that's the stance of 19th century Reform Judaism. We are modern people living in the modern world. We can use our reason to differentiate that which is still binding on us from our tradition and that which is not. As you saw in the video, however, not all Jews were happy with that idea. They didn't believe you could so easily separate the moral and the ritual law. One view, and this comes from a mid-20th century thinker, but I think it helps encapsulate some of the opposing views to the Reform movement, comes from a man named Abraham Joshua Heschel, from his book, God in Search of Man. Heschel was a rabbi, a leader in the civil rights movement, and a major Jewish thinker. Here's what he said about the law. What we must try to avoid is not only the failure to observe a single mitzvah, that's commandment, but the loss of the whole, the loss of belonging to the spiritual order of Jewish living. The order of Jewish living is meant to be not a set of rituals, but an order of all of man's existence, shaping all his traits, interests, and dispositions. Not so much the performance of single acts, the taking of a step now and then, as the pursuit of a way of being. According to Heschel, what the whole law did, ritual and moral, was to orient someone's whole life toward God. And in keeping the whole law, you were reminded every moment that your life was oriented toward God. Think about it this way. Some people, and you may be among them, have food sensitivities or allergies. It's a very different experience of going to a restaurant or the cafe or the grocery store if you have to think about every ingredient in your food. If you, kind of like me, can just go in and eat anything, you can do it pretty mindlessly. I'd like some chocolate. I should eat a carrot. I'd like some more chocolate. I'll have a stick of celery. I'll have more chocolate. I don't have to really think about what I'm doing. But if you have boundaries, things you have to pay attention to, your eating becomes or can become more mindful. Heschel in some ways is saying that about the effect of the law by asking people to think about whether they're eating milk and meat together and what they're wearing and are they prepared for the Sabbath? Can you really rest for 24 hours? You help people orient all of their lives towards God and to think about every feature of their lives, what they eat, how they spend their time, how they spend their money, what they wear, as an opportunity for holiness, for the sacred to be part of the everyday. People like Heschel thought people like Isaac Meyer Wise was taking that away and leaving just a very thin layer of Judaism. What happens to Judaism in the United States then is it splits. This is what happens to most religious groups in the United States. They split, in part because they can. Religious freedom allows people multiple ways to be Jewish or Protestant or Catholic, and so they split and do things their own way. There are three major branches of Judaism today in the United States. The Reform is the most theologically liberal. And again, its emphasis is on the moral law. The ritual law is not binding. The Conservative, and this might be a little confusing, is actually the middle position. For conservatives, law is binding but can be interpreted or adapted. You can think about how the law should look in modern society, but you don't get just to throw out some component of the law. And then the Orthodox. The Orthodox position gained a lot of adherents with successive waves of people coming from Eastern Europe. Remember I said that a lot of the Reform folk came from Central Europe? Well, early on at least, a lot of people coming from Eastern Europe, particularly places like Russia and Poland, where there had been no emancipation and enlightenment, came to the United States not real interested in assimilating to the society around them, but in being able to practice Judaism in a way they hadn't been able to in Eastern Europe. These are Orthodox Jews who see all law as binding and not a lot of room for adaptation. So, to think about what this looks like in practice. For the Reform, they often encourage some form of Shabbat or some form of recognizing the Sabbath. Do you have to stop working completely on the Sabbath? No. But should you pause? Should you relax? Should you recognize it as a day? Sure. For the Conservatives, they had to have this major discussion about whether it was okay for Jews to drive on the Sabbath. It's not something the Talmud covers because there were no cars. But what many conservatives decided was that you could drive on the Sabbath because driving on the Sabbath might enable you to go to synagogue, and going to synagogue was better than not going to synagogue. But you still needed to be observing the Sabbath. You shouldn't be driving to, say, Target and not going to synagogue. For Orthodox Jews, there's no driving on the Sabbath. It's work. You can't do work on the Sabbath. And the fact that there are cars in suburbs and we live long distances apart from each other doesn't change that. If you want to be a good Orthodox Jew, you need to figure out how to live in the same neighborhood as your synagogue so you can walk there on the Sabbath. Now again, in Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox Judaism, there are spectrums in all of that, but there are three fairly distinct ways of thinking about the law and how it works in our modern world. Next, we're going to turn to Protestants.